Hi everyone, my name is Wenjun. Today I'm going to present my research project, which is variable screening via complete least squares and distance correlation. So variable selection has been a very important procedure that finds the relevant predictors from a pool of predictors. There are a lot of techniques has been proposed and proved to perform very well. The techniques including lasso, adaptive lasso, elastic net, Lar's algorithm, and so on. However, when the predictor size gets much bigger than the sample size, it introduces a problem that it produces a result that are very noisy and unreliable. The reason for that is that the design matrix is going to have more columns than the rows, which gave us a very big singular X transpose X matrix. And then the result can be so small that it cannot be distinguished from the noise, as well as the variance and covariance matrix can be very ill conditioned. And also the predictors can have a very heavy-tailed density function. So, however, the large predictor size, it can be the case in the real life. For example, when we have tumor classification by using gene expression data, we can have a number of patients, which can be in the hundreds level, is our sample size. However, the gene expression data, which is our predictors, it will have a much larger size in the range of thousands and millions. And the sample size is going to turn out to be much smaller than the predictor size. Hence, it's going to be a problem to using the regular variable selection techniques in this case. Hence, the screening procedures is introduced to reduce the pool of potential predictors for a first run. Just like sifting gold, it will filter out the important predictors first. And then there are two screening procedures out there. The first one is called the sure independent screening. It ranks the predictors based on the marginal Pearson's correlation. It ranks the predictors using the absolute value of the correlations, and the larger indicating it has stronger importance, and then smaller closing to zero indicating it has a less importance in to the response. However, there's one problem with the sure independent screening procedure, which is that since Pearson's correlation does not pick up the nonlinear correlations, hence if we have a plot of response versus predictor as a graph here, we can see there is an obvious nonlinear correlation between the response and the predictors. The sure independent screening will not be able to pick up this predictor as an important predictor. To avoid that the SIS does not pick up the nonlinear correlations, DC-SIS is proposed by ranking the predictors based on the marginal distance correlation, which ranks the predictors based on its distance correlation with the response. However, there is another problem with both DC-SIS and SIS is that they only take into consideration of the correlation between the predictors and the response, but they don't take into the consideration of the relationship within the predictors. Hence, it might be a problem in some cases. Here is an example that can cause problems. In this case, we can see that the response and the variable 2 can have a relationship. However, since variable 2 is built on two groups that is defined by variable 1, if we don't consider about the grouping, then we can see there is a strong linear correlation between the response and variable 2. However, since variable 2 is strongly correlated with variable 1, if we take into the consideration of the grouping variable, then we can see that the response can have a very slim correlation with each group of the variables. So that SIS and SIS would pick up variable 2 as important. However, if taking into consideration of variable 1, it may not be important. So our proposed solution, variable screening via complete least squares and distance correlation, attacks both deficiencies. So this estimator is built on complete least squares estimator, which is shown here as beta hat. And then if the design matrix X is centered and scaled appropriately, and the response vector Y is centered and scaled properly, then we can replace X transpose X and X transpose Y with the appropriate correlation matrix. Here, instead of using the Pearson's correlation matrix, we use the distance correlation matrix, where the R X transpose X is the distance correlation matrix within X, and then R X transpose Y is the distance correlation matrix between X and Y. So that using this estimator, we would be able to capture both the correlation within the predictors and the relationship between the predictors and the response. So just to show the power of a distance correlation, as we can see in the plot here, we can see an obvious parabolic relationship between y and x. However, if we use general Pearson's correlation, it gets an absolute value of 0.06, which is fairly close to 0, indicating there is no correlation. However, if we use a distance correlation, it gave us a value of 0.55, which indicating there is a relatively strong correlation between y and x. So then, before we get into our simulation studies, we did a proof of concept using a smaller design matrix. So we designed a design matrix of 1,000 by 3 by size, and the first column is going to be following a normal distribution centered at 0 with a standard deviation of 0.5, and then the second column is strongly correlated with the first column by taking a negative sign function on the first column, adding a normal distribution centered at 0 with standard deviation of 0.5, and then the third column is just another random variable following a normal distribution, and then let the response be strongly correlated with V1 with the first column and the second column. However, the response is actually correlated with the sign function of the first column. And then we would compute the estimators using each approach that will be used for further ranking, including SIS, DC-SIS, and DC-CLS. And here we use a tau equal to 0.7 for DC-CLS. So using SIS, we can see that for the correlation between the response and the first column, it's fairly small, closing to 0 at 0.002. And the third column actually gets a bigger correlation than the first column. Hence, using SIS here, we will pick up the second and the third column as the important predictors. And using DC-SIS, the correlation between the response and the first column is bigger than the SIS. However, it's still not larger than the V3. So we are still picking up the second column and the third column. And then, however, using our approach, we are able to pick up V1, which gave us a much significant correlation than SIS and DC-SIS. And using DC-CLS, we will be able to pick up the correct correlation columns, which are the first column and the second column. So then we go into our simulation study. However, our simulation study shows that DC-CLS does not perform as well as either DC-SIS or SIS when there is no correlation within the predictors. And also, DC-CLS with some correlations does not perform as well as DC-SIS, but may perform better than SIS when there is a correlation within the predictors. And there are some future work may be needed to better evaluate this approach. And also, although our approach shows promise in the proof of concept, it's not competitive for general use. So that's all for my presentation. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Great. Thank you. There is a question coming from someone, and I'll just read it out. How is the distance correlation defined?
Okay, so I think the distance correlation is defined by the Euclidean distance between the characteristic functions of the two variables, and it has a range between 0 and 1. So it is not like Pearson's correlation, which goes from -1 to 1. Does that answer the question?
I think so. And I had maybe the person who asked the question can chat whether that is a good answer for them.
Okay.
Yeah, I had probably a related question. Can you define a little better for me what the complete part of complete least squares means?
Okay. Sorry, I need to think about this for a minute.
Oh. Well, actually, and I have another maybe simpler question I think I might have missed. Can you go back to your table of the table you had with V1, V2, V3?
Okay. Yes.
So I assume then what you're saying is that maybe I missed this. W is unrelated to V3 in your simulation?
Right. Yeah, I kind of forgot to mention this. I'm sorry. So W is not supposed to be related with V3. So we are actually not supposed to pick up V3 because when we build the response, it's not depending on V3. So we should not pick up V3. However, the first two approach are picking up the V3. So if we are taking two variables.
And so my question is, the numbers in that table, are those like coefficient values?
Oh, okay. So for SIS, the values are actually just marginal Pearson's correlation. So what we did is basically calculate the correlation between V1 and W, and then and calculate the Pearson's correlation between V2 and W, and V3 and W, and so on. And DC-SIS, for the numbers, they are actually just the distance correlation between the V1 and the response, and V2 and the response, and so on. And for ours, it's this beta estimator that we estimated from this expression here. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's great. Okay. I guess I don't see any other questions, so I'll ask one last one.
Okay.
So you said that it seems like this method doesn't outperform SIS and the other one when the predictors are uncorrelated. Is that right?
Yes.
So is there a way, I mean, have you thought that maybe in future work it's a decision, the first sort of step would be to decide if the predictors are highly correlated enough, and then the second stage would be, depending on the answer to the first question, use one or the other?
So we kind of think the reason why it does not work well when there is not a correlation in the system is because we are assuming there is a correlation, which gave a noise to the prediction. So yeah, I think, would you repeat your second question real quick? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm just wondering if you could envision a situation where you know, your first decision is to decide whether the predictors are sufficiently correlated, defined in some way, and then based on the answer to that question, you can decide whether to do SIS or
Oh,
DCLS.
oh yeah. I guess we haven't think about that so far. I'm sorry, but the case is we a case that we are thinking about using DCCLS is like using it in genetic data, which is like because there are linkage information between different genes according to their distance. So there is always a correlation within the predictors.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so I guess it is very important to actually identify if the predictors are independent or at first, and then decide which method to use.
Perfect. That's
So
that's great. Thank you very much.